And welcome to the Process Diary, where I document the development of my fashion collection. As I recently graduated with a bachelor's degree in fashion design, I am now creating a capsule collection out of leftover fabric and exploring ideas and techniques I didn't have the time for before. I took an existing collection print inspired by intrusive and revealing full body scans in airports and simplified it into uniform shapes and color blocks in Photoshop for the knitting experiment that I wanted to explore. I made a virtual mock-up in Clo3D, which I didn't like, but it helped me make a decision on the silhouette, and then I went out yarn shopping. Just came back from a really cute small yarn store, bought all of this yarn for the sweater that I'm planning, and to avoid all of the mistakes I'm going to cheat a little bit and take a sweater that already fits me pretty well and copy the pattern of it. It's pretty simple, it's like relatively straight on the sides, and especially because I'm thinking of maybe making it instead of a sweater into a vest, I might actually prefer the straight side so that it doesn't cling to the body too much and instead fits over like a shirt or something. I'm gonna copy this, probably alter it a little bit in Clo3D and then work around the print placement a little more because I simplified the prints of the body a bit more, but I might have to simplifying it even further so that the front flows into the back a bit better. I'll play around with it and then start knitting. So instead of going to bed a bit earlier like I anticipated, I decided to start the project right away, and I think I knit until about 4 AM. Started and restarted it multiple times because I wasn't sure how many stitches I should start with. This is 68 stitches in quite a thin yarn. I think it's size 3. And I have a bit of a variation. For example, this purple one is size 4, but that's alright, doesn't really matter. It does stand out a little bit, but I don't mind this extra texture. Anyway, I think last night I ended up somewhere here, and then this is all the progress I did today. This is so minuscule considering that I've been knitting for about 5 hours, and because I'm changing all the threads all the time, it's a lot of work really. I think I'm knitting with 15 balls of yarn simultaneously, and the back looks a little chaotic but a lot better than I anticipated, and it looks quite clean to be honest. Like, the reason why I have so many of the exact same color yarn balls is for me not to have too big of stretches. For example, in the beginning I had the same purple yarn ball. It created those loops that don't allow the piece to stretch enough, and I tried to pull those out as much as possible, but the wider this gap became, the more I understood that I actually had to maybe cut the tension and create 2 different balls of yarn. So that's the reason why I have 15 of those lying near my feet right now. You can see me untangling all the 15 yarn balls on the surface, which is actually a pleating board that I made for the graduate collection that is now doubling as a yarn holder. I later modified it a little bit and taped the sides shut so that the balls would stay in place when I flip the board and knit aggressively. I don't have knitting markers, and for those who don't knit, it's not a marker like a felt tip, it's a little clip that you attach to sections to just remember where you finished the edge or something. So I don't have those, and instead I'm using paper clips that are very fitting to my degree collection if you've watched the Process Diary series. So I'm marking every section that I've just finished, and this is the pattern that I'm working on. By the way, I thought I'd explain how I made this pattern. So because I mocked up the sweater vest in Clo3D, it gave me a flat pattern with my print overlay already. I later dropped it into Photoshop and added a grid of 10 by 10 centimeter squares using a new guide layout command. If you don't use Clo3D and you can't follow this method exactly, you can probably just copy a pattern from an existing item onto paper, take a photo of it with a ruler next to it for scale, and then drop it into Illustrator where you can trace it and then drop it into Photoshop to finish it up with your print and grid over top. You can also just eyeball it, I'm sure, but since I have access to all of those tools, I always try to incorporate my new skills as much as possible and develop them further. This section is marked with this clip because it's like 6 centimeters long, and this section is 10 centimeters long and marked with the other clip. So as you can tell, right now I'm here in this area when I'm about to start knitting the nipple piece, and maybe it's not that visible and it's also not perfect at all. Like, some areas I wish I did differently, but I'm giving myself time to finish the piece as well as I can, and then I'm gonna go back with a stitch that you can add over top of your knitting to finish different areas, to finish edges. Also, now you can see that some areas are a little bit puffy in their puckering because I didn't split the yarn balls when I needed to. I figured I'd just go back in, cut the threads and tie them with each other like in some sections here. I had to cut the ball off since there was no need for that color anymore, and I'm left with a long tail which I'll hide later on. Not sure if it's visible, but the lonely loose yarn I tied in a very specific way. I pulled it through a nearby purl stitch, leaving a loop on the sides, then I pulled the yarn through that loop, tightening it, leaving a loop on the side again, and repeated this process a few more times, tightening it at the end and cutting off the excess. Once the front was finished, I cut those areas with too much thread tension and tied those loose yarns with each other to make them somewhat neat looking. Now that I've tied all the loose ends on the back, it looks something like this. A little messy, but I'm going to clean it up afterwards. Right now I'm thinking of doing a stitch that I found on YouTube that is allowing you to add more of information onto your sweater. The pattern in itself is quite similar to what I was modeling it after. I missed a couple of things because I wasn't counting the stitches all that much. You'll see that this transition is a little bit wonky. Some of the areas aren't far enough. For example, in between the boobs, there is a point where this area is supposed to come up to. If we look at this drawing, so you can see there's the line, and even those boob areas actually start way below the ending point of this little area, which is not definitely the case of that. And there are a couple more things I'd like to change, for example, those holes. So what I'm thinking is I'm going to be stitching through those areas, cleaning them up, kind of raising this area. We'll see how that looks. And while I'm cleaning up those edges, I'm also going to be tightening some of the holes that are in some random areas throughout this piece because I wasn't twisting the yarns in between each other well enough. For example, in here you'll see that, like those areas, these are twisted pretty well, and you can tell that because this was happening towards the end. Those like grayish threads are interlooped between this white, and what this creates is this sort of raised area. It's a little bit more three-dimensional, whereas this section lies quite flat, and it's because on the back there is nothing that prevents it from lying flat, as opposed to this section which is tightened by those gray ones. So a couple of mistakes that I made. I mean, I don't hate it. I don't mind this little bit raised area, especially now that I'm going to be stitching through it again and creating a bit more 3D texture over top. It should be fine as long as your stitching yarn is thicker than the base yarn of the surface. I found that the purple overlays looked alright, whereas the light grey ones over blue looked very obvious, and I pulled those yarns out a few more times before I liked how they looked. And with that, the front section was done, and it was time to move on to the back portion. This time around, I knew what to avoid, and the knitting went by a lot faster. Actually, even before starting this whole project, I contemplated beginning with the back section to hide all of the mistakes there, but since I wasn't sure if I even wanted to fully cover the back, I wanted to reserve the yarns for the front portion, not to run out of them in the process. So at least the back section should be very nice and neat. So because I'm knitting with however many yarns right now, 13 or 12, I am gonna have to repeat the same thing I did on the front portion, which is when I twisted the two different color yarns in between each other so that when I pulled them apart, there would be no holes. You saw me patch up a couple of holes before, but I really want to try and avoid it as much as possible. So I'm gonna try to do that right from the start. This is the first area where I changed the color of the yarn. Now I'm supposed to knit with the purple one. So to create this sort of twisty effect, all I do is just twist two yarns in between each other and create this sort of like a chain effect, and I knit through the purl stitches like I would anyways. And then when I meet this section, as you can see now, because this yarn piece wasn't twisted or like knotted together with anything before, it kind of slips right now, but I'm gonna deal with it a bit later on once I have knit a little bit, like maybe 5-6 centimeters, so that this area is all clean and it's not very difficult to deal with. So I'm gonna leave it like this for now, but again, I'm gonna do this twist and purl stitch with my white thread now until I reach the next one. There's probably a smarter method to this madness. I haven't graduated with a knitwear degree. I haven't had any professional kind of knitwear training. That's just all I came up with while knitting for the first time with multiple colors. I've never done that before, so excuse my mistakes if you know better, but if you do, leave your suggestions in the comments because I would love to know. Now, because I was twisting those yarns when I was changing the colors, I am left with this kind of staircase looking thing, but it's very easily mitigated. When I'm knitting, I'm using this little board that I've makeshift made into like a tunnel situation so that it's a bit easier for me to turn around, because when I change the side that I'm knitting on, all the yarns get twisted and it might become a huge mess unless you do it like this. Obviously there might be better methods, that's just what I'm using. So when you turn your piece around, the staircase basically falls apart whenever you twist your yarns again when knitting through the colors. I'm currently cat sitting at my sister's, so my evenings are accompanied by knitting needles, Squid Game and a cat. I didn't pick the smartest method of transporting the yarn, so I was left with a giant jumbled mess, which the cat also enjoyed. As a result of this mess, I found a better method for storing the knitting projects in progress and for transporting them. I just basically speared the yarn balls onto a knitting needle in the same order as they were in my pattern. This kept them relatively organized even when they unraveled in the bag. I'll probably finish it relatively soon without another extra trip to the store, hopefully, but I'll be knitting the neckline and armhole ribbons to finish the whole thing off neatly, so stay tuned if you want to see that, and thank you for watching. See you next time. Bye!